So I want to begin talking a little bit about plagiarism and what plagiarism is. And that's kind of a down way to start maybe, because plagiarism is something that people fear, and it's certainly, when it's committed, it's a very bad thing. It's a violation of kind of intellectual and academic ethics. But I want to start there because really, to talk about plagiarism, it's not really a conversation about plagiarism. It's about how to do research well. In most cases, most people don't commit plagiarism, in my experience, because they just decide that they're not going to write a paper, and instead they're just going to copy and paste from somewhere. I've certainly seen that, and that's pretty easy to detect, and for a faculty person to be able to discipline a person for that. Usually cases of plagiarism are much more subtle than that, and really root from a person not knowing how to research well and how to convey their research well. And so I want to talk about that. Certainly, do not go and just cut and paste a paper or an argument from somewhere else. Without saying too much about this, let me just say that that is very easy to detect. You will be discovered, and those penalties for doing that are always going to be the highest, because a faculty member is going to know that that was an intentional act of deception, that you were shortchanging your education, you were stealing the thoughts and ideas of somebody else, and that's going to be disciplined at the highest kind of discipline. Most plagiarism that faculty discover are not going to be disciplined in that same way, because we recognize that it's a failure of research. But I want to give you some advice now so that really you can do the research well, so that you don't have to get into these concerns about whether you stole somebody else's idea. So the first thing is, if you're going to write a paper, you have to use sources. You can't just go and write whatever you think about the subject, unless the paper is an assignment that asks you what you think about something, sort of independent of whatever readings you might do. But for most research that you're going to write, you need to actually research and incorporate that research into the writing that you're going to be doing. That's part of what it means to engage in critical scholarship, is that you are engaging resources. But you absolutely have to document those resources. You have to be able to say, these are the places that I found this information, and this is who I'm attributing that argument to. And that's not only important because we need to be able to follow a person's research and to be able to discover where the ideas came from, but because you're not your own source of authority. If you are in this class, or you are in most sort of undergraduate or even seminary level courses, you are not an authority on the subject that you're writing on. If you were, we probably wouldn't be having you write these kinds of papers. If somebody has a PhD in a subject and they've been studying that subject for years and years and years, then they may begin to write from their own expertise and as their own source of authority. But for most of the projects that you would be working on, you're not the source of authority. And so you need to appeal to a higher source of authority. And that's how that's why we document the sources that we're engaging and the places that we find the arguments that we want to put forward, because we want to show that those arguments have come from a source of authority in what we're engaging with. You can't simply repeat what that person said, though. To simply repeat what they said is not a critical engagement. It's not there's not a lot of learning that happens when you're simply repeating. But instead, you want to engage with the sources. You want to begin to wrestle with them and argue with them. And that means that also means something more than just rewording the sentences. You might go and you see a sentence that says, well, that says what I want to be able to say in my paper. But you can't just go and reword some things that person has written and then either claim that for yourself, or even cite it and say, well, this is what they said, with just a reworded sentence. You really have to be able to absorb the information that a scholar or a resource has put forward, you want to absorb that information, put that into your own words, and then put that back into the paper. If it's something close to a quote, if it's something close to an exact phrasing, then normally, if it's more than 3 words that are directly borrowed from another source, more than 3 words, you would just go ahead and put that in quotation marks if it's a short quote, and put a citation. If it's a long quote of more than 4 lines, then you would put that in a block quote format and cite it that way. We don't put big, huge quotes in normal text. You would block those out if they're more than 4 lines. And we also do not want a paper that is entirely quotes. You shouldn't have a paper that has quote, 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 quote. Quotes should be limited. Maybe I would say not more than about 10% of a paper should be quotes. And those should be relevant and supporting an argument that you're already making. The quote shouldn't make the argument for you, but should be supporting and engaging with the argument that you want to make. So here's my advice. Whenever you are going to sit down and write a research paper, no matter what that research paper looks like, go and read sources until you find a source that says something that either you agree with in a significant way or that challenges your ideas and you want to argue with this resource that you are engaging with. Read the resource. Read it carefully. Take the book, turn it upside down so you can't see it, and then write what you think they said. That's one of the best practices for being able to understand, did I really understand what that person just said? And to make sure that I don't just regurgitate out and copy and take their ideas, but put that into my own words without the use of just word for word sort of dictation of what the person said. Set the resource aside, turn it over, and write out what you think they said, and then cite it as that's the source for what I just said. It's your words, it's your research, it's your conclusions, but with the source of authority being in someone else who is cited according to the standards of whatever format you're using. If you're writing for my class, I am not particularly picky about which of the established formats that you use. If you're familiar with MLA, if you're familiar with Chicago or Turabian style, I'm not a big fan of APA, but even if you already are kind of an expert and you're familiar with writing in APA format, I'm even okay with that one. It doesn't work very well for theology, but to me, the format is less important than that you have a standard form of documentation so that you can document your sources appropriately. One thing I would say, when do you not need to cite the source? When does that become no longer important? If every book that you read on a subject has the same conclusion on the subject, the same details of matter of fact, then it becomes unnecessary to cite a source. So, for example, if you were to say, John Wesley was the founder of the United Methodist movement, that's not something we need to cite. Because even though Wesley was not a United Methodist, we can all agree that there's a trajectory of founding, of establishing what became the United Methodist Church that goes back to John Wesley. That's not something that you would need to cite. You don't need to cite, for example, that Methodists are sacramental people. We basically all agree that Methodists are sacramental people, and so we can say that without citation. But if you're going to begin to make an argument for that and citing specific details about how Methodists are sacramental or what Wesley did to found the United Methodist Church, now we're going to get into more detailed information that likely is going to require citation according to how I just described. hopefully that's helpful. If you ever have a question about plagiarism, your faculty, including me, are going to be glad to talk about how to help you make sure that you are citing sources appropriately.